All right, for the second video, I'm just going to go through numbers 5 and 6. So, number 5, I look at that. Obviously, we have to start with the left side. And I would, again, probably put everything in terms of sine and cosine. So, secant is 1 over the cosine. And tangent is sine over the cosine. So I look at that and say we need to get a common denominator. This one has a denominator of cosine, so does this one, because remember this is sine over 1. So that has a denominator of cosine. It's sine squared over cosine. And then I look at that middle fraction, and it's over 1. So I need to multiply this one by cosine over cosine. So this one's going to stay the same. This one, when I multiply by cosine over cosine, I'm going to get cosine squared over cosine. And this one, I'm going to have sine squared on top and cosine of theta in the denominator. So now I can put them all together. When I go to put them all together, I see that I have 1 minus cosine squared, let's say. I know when I put that together, 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared, so I can do that. Squared theta. So this becomes sine squared theta minus the sine squared theta I had there, still all over cosine. Sine squared minus sine squared is 0. So it does equal 0. All right. Then number 6. Number 6 is, again, that sum of cubes, so I'm sure we want to start with that side. So this side is sine of theta plus cosine theta. So you're going to have to make sure you know that sum of cubes. And then it's squared minus the product, sine times cosine, plus cosine squared. So make sure you remember that sum and difference of cubes. Okay, in the denominator, I wasn't quite sure what to do with that when I looked at this first, because I don't really have anything about this. I could replace this with 1 minus sine squared, so, you know, that might be something you would have thought of. And I think if you tried that it might not have really helped you too much, so you might have to go back to saying, what else could I do? So when I looked at this, I still knew I wanted to keep 2 terms, so I guess I thought of this as, what if I wrote this as 1 minus the cosine squared minus the cosine squared? So I kind of, just like we did in the problem on the front side of the sheet, I just wrote negative 2 cosine squareds as a minus 1 of those and another minus 1 of those. All right, why did I do that? Well, because I know that this 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared. So I'm going to rewrite the numerator. The first binomial has to stay the same. Second binomial or trinomial, I think I would change it to a binomial by adding sine squared plus cosine squared. So that's 1 minus sine theta cosine theta. And then in the denominator, like I said, this becomes sine squared minus cosine squared theta. All right, and I'm still looking at this thinking, well, where did that get me? Where did that lead me to? And I look at where I'm trying to go, and this still doesn't really give me much of a hint that if I'm here, how am I going to get to there? So then I just look at this and say, what else can I do with it? And I see some algebra I could do in the denominator. I see that this is the difference of perfect squares. So if I factor that, I'm going to leave the numerator as is. Because again, going to where I'm trying to get to really hasn't helped me at this point yet. But if I do the algebra step, if I say, okay, this becomes sine of theta plus cosine theta times sine of theta minus cosine theta. And then I realize, okay, now that I factor that as a difference of square, that's going to go away. All right, so I'm getting closer, I think, because I have 2 terms in the numerator and I have 2 terms in the denominator. They're still not where I'm trying to get to. Oops, I'm sorry, I got you out of the screen. They're still not where I'm trying to get to. But at least I know that I'm down to 2 terms on the top and 2 terms on the bottom. Okay, so again, what did we do? You know, we factors as the sum of cubes. I wasn't sure what to do with this piece, but we decided to write it as 1 minus cosine squared minus cosine squared, so that became sine squared minus cosine squared, and that could be factored as the difference of squares. All right, so then you're left with this piece. And now you can again try to peek at where you're trying to go to, and you're trying to go to secant minus sine. So I look at this and say, okay, how would I get that to be a secant? I'd have to divide by the cosine. How would I get that to be a sine? I'd have to divide by the cosine. How would I get this to be a tangent? I'd have to divide by cosine. How would I get that to be a 1? I'd have to divide by cosine. So really then that tells me that I'm going to take what's left here, and all I really need to do is multiply by 1 over cosine, because remember we were dividing by cosine, over 1 over cosine. So that's still a form of 1. I'm multiplying by 1 over cosine times 1 over cosine. Remember, this already went away. It's already canceled out. So when I multiply 1 over cosine times 1, I'm going to be left with, whoops, let me get this so you can see it, 1 over cosine. When I multiply this term by 1 over cosines, the cosines will cancel. I'll be left with minus sine. This term, I'm going to be left with sine over cosine. So this is an algebra step we're doing. And then this, when we multiply anything by its reciprocal, we get 1. So that was an algebra step that we know that we are multiplying by the same thing, everything by 1 over cosine. Now let's do the trig step. 1 over cosine is secant minus the sine. Sine over cosine is tangent minus 1. And that's where we were trying to get to. Okay, so once you got to this step here and you realize you didn't really know how to get to this at first maybe, but you did know at least you had 2 terms on the top and 2 terms on the bottom, that's when you might want to say, how can I get to secant and sine? Both of these I could divide by cosine. How can I get to tangent minus 1? Both of these I can divide by cosine. So as long as I'm doing the same thing, I'm multiplying by 1, a form of 1, do the algebra to show what that equals, and then use your trig to tell me what that simplifies to. Okay? So that is the end of worksheet 2.